Hello, I'm Gunnar Abramson, one of the volunteers at our local Crown Point Country Historical Society Museum here in Corbett. I'm an amateur historian, but I am also a professional historian, and one of my degrees was in modern Japanese history, and one of my interests as it relates to this area has been the Dekasegi, the sojourners, the remittance men, the pioneers of Japan who came over here as immigrants and added to the economy and the culture and the history of this area. Obviously, I think most people who know anything about Pacific Northwest history are aware of the Chinese railroad workers, the Chinese cannery workers. A lot of them in Astoria, some of them down the river here, some in Portland at the time in the late 19th century or early the 20th century. They might not be as familiar with Japanese story aside from the internment during World War II, but in my research, the first Japanese to this whole entire area, the Pacific Northwest in general, were three sailors who were shipwrecked at sea. The rudder broke in their vessel in 1832, and 2 years later, they washed ashore in what is now the Olympic Peninsula of Washington. They were stayed among the Makah tribe. Word reached John McLaughlin of the Fort Vancouver, Hudson's Bay Company head factor in what is now Vancouver, Washington. And he dispatched a boat to pick these guys up. He brought them back to Vancouver, to Fort Vancouver. And they, among other things, learned English from Cyrus Shepherd, who was a local American pioneer passing through. So a very interesting story there. After that, there isn't a lot of activity until the railroads start coming out west here to the Pacific Northwest and also to California and BC and Alberta and Canada. And there's a need for cheap labor, and a lot of young Japanese men, much like young Chinese men immediately before them, see America and to an extent Canada as well as fantastic places to earn one's keep. And in many cases, they were younger sons of large extended Japanese families, but not always. Most of them came from southwest Japan. So Hiroshima Prefecture, Yamaguchi Prefecture, Okayama Prefecture, those kind of places, but not exclusively. Initially, a lot of them grew hops in the Portland area. In fact, I have the earliest record I have is of a group of young men from Wakayama Prefecture coming to Sherwood, Oregon, and farming hops. After a while, they started to cluster downtown Portland. They formed something called Nihonmachi, or Japantown in English. It was sort of the Japanese quarter of town until World War II, and they were mostly interned. And some of these young men came out east. In fact, in 1880, we have the arrival of a Scotsman, Scots-Australian, by the name of Andrew McKinnon. And Andrew McKinnon is interesting because in 1872, he had, in Japan, been one of the first Westerners into the country after the so-called Meiji Restoration, in which Japan threw off its feudal past and began to westernize and modernize. And he started the first stagecoach service from Tokyo to Yokohama. Not a long distance now. I've been on the train from Tokyo to Yokohama, so I know the distance, but at the time it was long distance, and he was the first one to do it. And while he was there, he started an agricultural school in northern Honshu, a place called Shimokita up in Aomori Prefecture. And while there, he met his wife, Mio Iwakoshi, and she was the daughter of a samurai, and they came to Orient, or what became Orient, Oregon, which is East County here. And he opened a sawmill, and he actually made pieces of railroad track at his sawmill. And he would die in 1886 here in Orient. And the reason that it was called Orient was because it was reference to the Orient where his wife came from. I've heard various erroneous other accounts that it was the easternmost post office in the county. That's not true. It was actually comes from Mio Iwakoshi's the location on the globe where Mio Iwakoshi came from, according to her husband. So, hence the name Orient. They had one daughter initially, and then several more as time went on. One of them died tragically at the hands of ironically enough, a young Japanese immigrant. Very, very sad story. Her name was Minnie McKinnon. But overall, their children joined the ranks of the early 20th century's swelling East County Japanese community. There were several hundred to several thousand young Japanese here, mostly men, mostly itinerant. A lot of them started off working in the canneries here in the Hurlburt district, which is actually near where I live. That was the name for the census district in this area. And I have seen several Japanese and Chinese names from this area, and most of them were bunking at canneries owned by the Hume brothers, the Scots Hume brothers, which were big cannery outfit around here, as well as that of Frederick G. Warren, after whom Warrendale, the small town of Warrendale, the village of Warrendale east of us, is named. There were several families here in Corbett. Some of them have descendants who are still here, or at least in the area in East Portland, or the general area. They had businesses, they had stores. We had a Japanese grocery store in Gresham Troutdale. We had a dojo. We had a kendo dojo, a kendo meeting place in Gresham. The Shiki family, Shiiki, ran it. We had a kendo dojo of all places, Bingen, Washington, on the other side of the river, also founded by Japanese immigrants. We had a lot of Japanese in Parkdale, Hood River. Many of them had apple orchards, and one of the most famous was, of course, the Yasui family. Masuo Yasui was, one might say, the patriarch, and certainly the go-to guy in terms of as a labor contractor and as just a pillar of the local East County Japanese community. In fact, if you go to Yokohama, Japan, they have the Immigration Museum there. You'll see a plastic replica of the float that Masuo Yasui created for the 1908 Portland Rose Festival parade. So, a very interesting guy. You have the Takeuchi brothers, who also owned a farm out here. Initially, they'd owned a barber shop down in Nihon Machi. Very interesting time, very interesting place, very interesting community here. They faced some discrimination, but they ended up doing very, very well for themselves too. There was the issue, of course, internment. A lot of them were interned in various internment camps across the West. Some of them, of course, and this is something very few people seem to know with the internment narrative, is a lot of them who left the West Coast exclusion zone went to college back east, went to college in even in the American South in a few cases, and were treated pretty well. And some of them came back, lost their farms completely. Some of them regained their farms entirely. Some of them just didn't want to go back to farming when they came back to the East County area, and of course some of them did. Some of them are still here. Some of them went to just after the war, the settlement of out in Delta Park, Vanport, and sadly the editor of one of the local Japanese newspapers lost all of his back issues of the Oshu Nippo during the flood of 1946 in Vanport. So there's a lot of stories, a lot of interesting stories. The first Japanese man to wed in Portland, to wed another Japanese in Portland, Shintaro Takaki. He also had a house in Gresham. In fact, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, he and his wife, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. They did not move back, but lived in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, until his death in 1968. So actually, there's the beginning of the Portland East County Japanese community extends into the 1960s in the flesh. So very interesting history, and we hope to have more. Exhibits about this community out here. Various immigrant communities, various settler communities, indigenous community, and also, of course, which is something that cuts across ethnic lines, and has been as much a unifier as a divider as anything else in this part of the world. Various ways in which man in East County and women have modified the land for pleasure and profit. Fishing, gardening, horticulture, logging, ranching are all aspects that tie in directly with each of these communities, because they all, to some extent, were involved in them. So we welcome you to our museum, and we hope to be able to bring you further information about the Nikkei of, that is to say, people of Japanese ancestry from the perspective of those who settle in this area. So, thank you very much.